Okay, this is the recording for Lecture 9, and the topic of this lecture is cooperation. This is the outline for the topics we're going to cover in this lecture, and I just want to highlight that later on in the lecture I'm going to present an opportunity for you to take part in an activity where you can get a little bit of bonus on our final exam. Just as a quick reminder, this Friday, March 18, the assigned reading for the week is by Kahn et al., and it's an experiment about lost wallets. And we will have a weekly group assignment on Friday, and as usual, you can either attend on campus in the Nickel building or you can meet on Zoom. Okay, so getting started on cooperation and helping behavior. As some initial definitions, we can consider that helping behavior includes behaviors that are beneficial to the recipient. So last week we talked about conflict. Those were behaviors that were detrimental to the recipient, and now we're doing kind of pro-social helping behavior, things that help the recipient. And they could either be costly to the actor or beneficial to the actor. In this lecture, we're going to mainly focus on helping and pro-social behaviors that occur within species, so where members of a species are doing helping behaviors to their own species, but help also occurs between members of different species. And in particular, interspecific mutualisms are interactions involving two different species in which both actors may gain an immediate benefit. And there are some examples of that shown on this slide from things like pollination mutualisms, where the bat obtains nectar from this cactus and the cactus gets a pollination service, or other systems like these grooming mutualisms that you see with the zebra being groomed by these oxpecker birds that get a meal, and the zebra gets parasite defense. And up on the top left, you see an example of a cleaning mutualism in fish, and we'll see a short video of that later on in this lecture, where this is a blue streak cleaner wrasse. It's a fish that specializes on going in the mouths of bigger fish to remove parasites. And it's really remarkable behavior because this much bigger fish could easily just gobble up the cleaner wrasse, but they don't. They come to these kind of ritualized locations where they come to get cleaned, and they restrain themselves from trying to eat the cleaner. And so the cleaner gets a meal, and the larger fish that's getting cleaned gets the benefit of parasite protection again. And the last example in the lower right of this slide is an ant bullhorn acacia tree with a colony of ants living in it. And so there's many of these mutualisms between tree species and ant species, where the ants live in hollowed out thorns of these trees, and so the ants provide the tree with defense against herbivores, and the tree provides the ants with a home. Okay, so focusing on helping within a species, this is an extreme example. You probably all know if you get stung by a honeybee, it's a fatal injury to the honeybee. And so that's an example of extreme helping. The honeybee is sacrificing its own life for the defense of its fellow colony members. And so the question is this cooperation or altruism? Well, take a look back at the previous slide 2 or 3 slides ago and come up with an answer here. And you might say, well, it looks like altruism, right? Because the honeybee that did the stinging is dying. It's paying the ultimate price for defending its colony members by losing its life. But the amazing thing is, when you get in there and look at inclusive fitness, it may actually be cooperation, because the honeybee is so related to its hive mates that in fact there may be a net benefit, and if we look at kind of the genetic level. Okay, and just to take it to a human example, we've seen this before, much earlier in the course. In the Middle Ages, there were many outbreaks of bubonic plague, and in some cases, people in whole villages made an altruistic decision to quarantine themselves, sometimes for long periods of time. And back when I taught this course 2 years ago, the quarantine of 1 year by this village seemed like a remarkably long period of time. And now we know, like with COVID-19, that it doesn't seem so strange anymore. Okay, so just thinking about humans and primates, this is a about 2 or 3 minute video clip from a PBS series called The Human Spark that shows you how helpfulness starts really early on in our lives. And so if YouTube makes me remove this clip for copyright reasons from the upload, I would encourage you to go and watch it on your own. Okay, so I'll try to play it now.
But the Max Planck team also tested children and apes for their social skills.
Hier. So. Und hier. Und hier. Oh. So. Und hier. Fertig.
Let's see, I'll put this one up here, and then I'll just put this one up. Oh.
The help the kids gave was entirely spontaneous.
Thank you. Dankeschön. Okay, all done.
The surprise was that chimps also volunteer when an object is out of reach.
So this suggests that potentially altruistic motivation to act on behalf of others is something that is shared among chimpanzees and humans, and therefore something that maybe was already a characteristic of our common ancestor.
But if the impulse to help has deep evolutionary roots, in humans, it's blossomed.
Habe ich da alles reingetan? Guck mal. Guck mal, Shishi, hier habe ich noch mehr. Ah? Guck. Oh. Ah. Ui. Die sind aber schwer, hä? Guck. Oh. Geht nicht. So, und drin. Haha!
While helping in chimps was limited to reaching tasks, human children are eager to help with all sorts of troubles. And what's more, they seem to enjoy it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so helping was once considered to be an evolutionary paradox in biology because it's difficult to imagine how a behavior that appears to lower an individual's own fitness would spread over evolutionary time. And so we can imagine a scenario with cooperators, a population of cooperators, and suppose a mutation arises, and now there's an individual denoted by a D in this diagram who doesn't cooperate, who receives help from others, but doesn't provide help. Well, of course, D would be the strategy with the best relative payoff, right? D would be the evolutionarily favored strategy here. And so selection over time would be expected to produce a population of all defectors, exploitative defectors. So how is it that we see helping in the animal kingdom? Well, we now know that there are actually several different evolutionary pathways that can favor helping behavior. In other words, there are several different scenarios where helping behavior can be favored because it provides a net inclusive fitness benefit. And in the following slides, in the next section of this lecture, we're going to cover 4 of these evolutionary pathways. And we'll have lots of video examples. Before we do that, I just want to set up some of the important considerations about the potential costs and benefits of help. Okay, so when we're thinking about these costs and benefits, these are the kind of dimensions that we have to think about. The first one is permanence. If there's a cost to the donor, how permanent is it? How big is this cost? Of course, the honeybee sacrificing its life, that's a permanent cost, right? And we can also think about helping behavior that is either obligate or facultative. So obligate helping is where there's a permanent loss of direct fitness. And so another example of that from honeybees is that the workers are forgoing their own reproduction. They've kind of lost the ability to reproduce. So the honeybee workers, the female workers in the hive, they forage for the colony, but they never reproduce. It's an obligate helping phenotype. Facultative helping, on the other hand, refers to a temporary reduction in direct fitness, so something that's less permanent. For example, in scrub jays that do cooperative breeding, where it's not just the parents who raise the offspring at a nest, there's also helpers. Helping in that system is facultative. And so often a young scrub jay will spend a year helping to raise its siblings, but it can still go and reproduce on its own later on. Okay, another dimension to consider is timing. So if the donor, if the helper is getting a benefit, when does that benefit occur? Does it occur right away? Does it occur many years later? So immediate gains an example of something that has immediate gains might be cooperative hunting, for example, where multiple wolves are working together to take down a large prey, and the individuals that take part in that hunt get an immediate energetic benefit for all parties involved. Delayed benefits might include things like alloparental care, again, which might be caring for somebody else's offspring. And so we'll see examples in this lecture. We've seen examples before where individuals adopt or provide care for somebody else's offspring, and sometimes that favor can be returned in the future, but that benefit might be much delayed, sometimes even by years. Okay, the third dimension that's important to consider is kinship, and we've already learned about this in our lecture on kinship as a kind of guiding concept in social evolution. And so we need to think about what types of fitness benefits are involved. Are there direct fitness benefits, which would increase the helper's own reproductive success and survival? Or are there indirect fitness benefits, which would increase the helper's inclusive fitness via providing benefits to the helper's close kin? Okay, so now we can get into these 4 pathways to the evolution of helping. And this is the bulk of this lecture. And the first one is one that you are already familiar with, kin selection. We've seen it before. And this is a remarkable quote from Charles Darwin in the 1800s about eusocial insects. And it's kind of it's written in 1800s language, so it's a bit like ponderous and hard to understand. But he says, I can see no real difficulty in any character or trait having become correlated with a sterile condition of certain insect communities. The difficulty, though appearing insuperable, is lessened or maybe disappears when it is remembered that selection may be applied to the family as well as the individual. So this was 100 years before Hamilton came up with Hamilton's rule, and Darwin already had the inklings of it. He was already writing about how perhaps selection acted on family members, not just the individual. Okay, so recall Hamilton's rule. Helping is favored if the relatedness times the benefit minus the cost is greater than 0. So in other words, the relatedness times the benefit of helping must be greater than the cost of helping to the helper. And so any genetic mutation that promotes helping behavior may be favored when individuals help close relatives with a high value of R that have a high probability of sharing the same genotype at that locus. Okay, so we've seen that in an entire lecture before. Here's a little example. It's been proposed for Lek-based mating systems that perhaps they're an example of cooperation among kin. And evidence for this came from a study in the 1990s of peafowl in a zoo population in England. And the researchers on that study, the lead author was Marion Petrie. She did an experiment where she reared some or hatched some eggs in captivity. And so the eggs that she hatched in captivity were hatched in incubators, and these peacocks never encountered their parents or siblings. And what she showed was that if you released those captive hatched males into this semi-natural zoo population, what happened was they set up territories. They kind of grew up to be adults and set up territories and started to display. But the males, who were brothers, tended to set up next to each other more often than you might expect just by random chance. And so it suggests that, for one thing, peacocks can recognize their kin without ever having met their kin before. It also suggests that they can do this in the absence of sort of environmental cues for who's kin. And it suggests that maybe the inclusive benefits of attracting females to your nearby kin might explain the evolution of lekking behavior. Now, this is just one study, and it's not a hypothesis that's been widely tested in other lekking species, but it's a really intriguing one. Okay, so we've seen how it's often favorable for animals to help kin. That's our first pathway to helping. But many animals provide help to non-kin. And the next video clip I'm going to show you here is from a remarkable study of African gray parrots and other parrot species in the lab. And you're going to see these parrot species playing this helping game that the researchers trained them to play involving tokens. And these tokens worked a little bit like money. And so these birds had been in the lab for many years and had been taught by the researchers that these tokens, I think they're washers, these tokens could be exchanged for their favorite food treats. Okay, so you're going to see what happens when the researcher provides tokens to one bird, but requests tokens from another. And so let's watch and see what these African gray parrots do. Okay, so that's really remarkable behavior. They're helping other individuals that are not their kin. Right? These parrots were not related to each other in this experiment. And the researchers found that the birds would reciprocate help once the roles in the experiment were reversed. And they found that the amount of help they provided was related to how strong the affiliation was for a given pair of birds. So the more interactions they'd had in the past, the more willing they were to help each other out. Now they didn't just test African gray parrots, they tested another species of highly social parrot as well, the blue-headed macaw. And the blue-headed macaws did not help each other. And so that raises this fascinating question. Like, these are both highly social species from the same clade of birds. They both have, they're very intelligent for a bird. They're both known for having very large brains relative to their body size. So just being social is not enough to explain this behavior. Just being smart is not enough to explain it. So why would the African gray parrots help in this experiment, but the blue-headed macaws did not? Well, we don't know yet, and the authors in their paper speculate that perhaps these species differ in their social tolerance to strangers. And it's kind of a question for further research. And so the research team stated in their paper, it's a really fascinating read, they stated that one of the next things they want to do is to investigate how widespread this kind of voluntary help is among the 393 parrot species that there are around the world, to try to understand what are the evolutionary pressures underlying these differences. Okay, so that brings us to the second pathway to the evolution of helping, and that is reciprocity. Okay, so reciprocity refers to a scenario where individuals exchange cooperative acts, such that the benefit of providing help is that you receive help back from others. And so this should be familiar to everybody, really. But there's actually three types. So within this pathway, there's three subtypes of reciprocity. We have direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, and social network reciprocity. And they each have their own kind of labels there. And so in the next few slides, we'll define each of these three types of reciprocity. We'll start with direct reciprocity. And so, of course, this should be really familiar to everybody. Direct reciprocity is just, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Okay, so direct reciprocity can promote the evolution of helping if you're in a social system where it's highly likely that you'll meet the same individual again. If you're kind of like deep sea fish that, like, with a very low probability of ever encountering the same individual, we wouldn't expect direct reciprocity to be a mechanism that would promote helping behavior. In addition, the benefits of providing help must outweigh the cost of providing it. And it's usually thought that there should be an opportunity to punish or retaliate against cheaters. And this is called tit for tat. Tit for tat means if you help me, I'll help you back. If you hurt me, I'll hurt you back. And so Hamilton's rule can also be modified for the direct reciprocity scenario, and the inequality that you see on the bottom of the slide there is providing that modification. And so researchers, like theorists, I should say, have shown that direct reciprocity is favored if W times B for benefit, minus C, the cost of providing help, is greater than 0. And W here is the probability of re-encountering the same individual later on. And so that's kind of the mathematical formalization of the first bullet point, where reciprocity is favored if the probability of meeting that same individual is high, if W is high. Okay, so consistent with the theory, we see that many animals do indeed exchange favors through repeated interactions. And the graph you're seeing on the screen is from a almost 30-year-old study of impala in Africa. And so impala, like many other mammals, do allogrooming. Allogrooming is where one individual grooms another. Even peacocks I've seen doing allogrooming. And what the researchers found was that the impalas will provide more grooming for the social partners that they received the most grooming from. And so the graph there is showing this very strong correlation between the number of grooming bouts received and the number of grooming bouts delivered between specific pairs of impala. Okay, so another short clip here, about 2 or 3 minutes, I think, of a fascinating example of reciprocity in vampire bats. This is from the PBS program Nova. Again, if I have to remove this clip for copyright, I really recommend that you go and watch it. The link is there at the bottom of the slide.
Have you ever shared your dinner with a friend who is hungry? Then you're more like a vampire bat than you might have thought. Vampire bats practice hematophagy, which means they feed exclusively on blood. But unlike their mythical counterparts, vampire bats don't actually suck blood. Instead, they use their razor-sharp teeth to bite mammals, typically horses and cows, although sometimes humans, and then lap up the blood that escapes from the wound. Fortunately for their victims, vampire bats don't take enough blood to kill. But finding enough blood to eat isn't always easy. Vampire bats hunt on most nights, but if they're unsuccessful for more than 2 nights in a row, they will starve to death. Fortunately, vampire bats, just like people, are often willing to help their friends. In fact, to prevent a fellow bat from starving, female vampire bats will sometimes regurgitate a portion of their most recent blood meal into the mouths of nearby female vampire bats. But proximity alone doesn't guarantee this behavior. Vampire bats use a practice called reciprocal altruism. They learn to recognize bats who've shared with them in the past, and they only share with them. This includes familial relatives and current or former roostmates. Basically, they're friends. So far in the wild, scientists haven't found any evidence that male vampire bats participate in this food-sharing process. And while the reason for the divide between sexes isn't completely understood, what is clear is that female vampire bats, like humans, get by with a little help from their friends.
Okay, so here's some data from the researchers who studied this behavior in the vampire bats. And so they were establishing this process of reciprocity in this study. And so you're seeing 3 graphs here. And the y-axis on all 3 graphs is plotting the amount of a blood meal donated. And it's in kind of residual units, and so that's why there's negative values on the smallest values here are negative, and it must be log transformed or something like that. But so the researchers measured how much blood meal was donated from one vampire bat to another, And they found that these 3 different variables were all predictors of this Y variable. And so the 3 predictors are the amount of blood meal that the donator had previously received, right? So the more they had received from a friend, the more they were likely to give. They also found that the amount of allogrooming received from that friend in the past was another important predictor. The more grooming they'd received from that individual, the more meal they'd be likely to donate. And they found that the genetic relatedness between the pair was a substantial predictor. With more highly related pairs, the amount of sharing, the amount of donation was greater in that for highly related pairs. Okay, so that suggests together that that both kin selection and direct reciprocity may be at play in the evolution of this helping behavior in vampire bats. Okay, so moving on to our next type of reciprocity, we have indirect reciprocity. And so we're getting a bit more complicated here. Indirect reciprocity is when you scratch my back and someone else will eventually scratch yours. So indirect reciprocity is helping based on reputation, and it's sometimes also called image scoring. And the idea is that if I help somebody, I gain a good reputation. And if I have a good reputation for being this kind of helping, positively seen individual, then I will be likely to receive help from somebody else as a result. So this can ask the question, could this lead to the evolution of virtual signaling behaviors, helping because others are watching and you want to increase your self-image? Okay, indirect reciprocity is favored. It can be expressed in terms of Hamilton's rule as well, but with a slight modification. It's favored if Q times the benefit minus the cost of helping is greater than 0. And in this case, Q represents the probability that the receiver's reputation is good. Okay, so if the B is the benefit to the actor, C is the cost to the actor, and Q is the probability that the receiver has a good reputation. Okay, so when we read the paper for this Friday, it's interesting to think about, are the people in this paper who return the wallets, or if you find a wallet and you return it and turn it in, is that something that's altruistic on your behalf? Or are you gaining a reputation as being an honest, good person by doing that? Are you gaining a benefit by doing that? An interesting question that the authors of the paper have to deal with to kind of establish their conclusions. All right, so as an example where reputation matters, I have a short video clip here of cleaner fish mutualism. So this is helping between members of 2 different species. And what you're going to see in this clip is a big barracuda getting cleaned by one of these little cleaner fishes in its mouth. So go ahead and play the clip. I don't think there's any sound here. Okay, so you can see the cleaning happening. So this is like this special place where the large fish come to get cleaned. And they assume this position to get cleaned as well. And so again, it's really remarkable because the barracuda is restraining itself from eating this meal, the snack-sized cleaner. And the other thing is, the cleaner fish are restraining themselves too. They occasionally take a bite out of the bigger, cleaner fish. And in fact, if they're given the option, they prefer to take a bite of flesh than they do to eat the little parasites that they get out of the teeth. And so the cleaner fish are also exercising restraint. And in this really neat experiment, the researchers created a bunch of situations in the lab where they could manipulate who was watching this interaction. They could manipulate what the fish were able to see by using like one-way mirrors and things like that in these tanks. And so the question was, would the behavior of these mutualisms, would it differ depending on whether a bystander was watching? And so these are a couple of the conditions that they had in their experiment. So the experiment at the top had 2 big client fish and 2 little cleaner fish on the outsides of this tank. And then in the middle of this tank system, there was a bystander fish that could not be seen by the clients or the cleaner. So it was put in a situation where like one-way mirrors blocked the outer tanks from viewing the bystander on top. Okay, and so the question in that first experiment was, would the bystander prefer to go over to the cleaner that had done a better job, that had been like nicer to the client? And so the question was, would the bystander go to the left or to the right? Would it choose the side where the cleaner was nicer? And so they found that indeed the bystander could perceive how good a job the cleaner did and whether the cleaner took some exploitative bites of the client, and the bystander would go to the side where the cleaner had taken fewer of these exploitative bites. The second experiment on the lower part of the slide had a bystander that could be seen by the client and the cleaner. And this experiment, they both had trials where the bystander could be seen and trials where the bystander was there but was blocked behind a one-way mirror. And so the question was, would the cleaners behave differently depending on whether they knew a bystander was watching or not? And so here are the results of that second experiment from the lower part of the previous slide. And so again, the question was, would the cleaner fish act more nice when a bystander was there? So the first thing they found on the left was that the amount of cleaning provided, how many seconds the cleaner spent cleaning, it was not affected. They found no significant difference between these two conditions of bystander being visible or not visible. However, what they found was that the cleaners did fewer of these exploitative, nasty bites. And so the y-axis on this graph is the number of exploitative bites per unit time. So there were fewer of them when the bystander was visible, and there were fewer exploitative bites per kind of episode of contact with the client if the bystander was present. So indeed, the bystanders have an effect, and the cleaner fish perceive whether or not a bystander is there and adjust their behavior accordingly. So again, reputation really does matter. This audience effect matters in this system. Okay, the third type of reciprocity is called social network reciprocity. And again, it's a little bit complicated, but social network reciprocity is the idea of paying it forward. And so often in natural populations, individuals can choose who their social partners are. And very often we see social networks will be positively assorted. We've seen that before when we learned about social networks. Very often you'll find that like individuals with similar phenotypes tend to stick together. And the kind of English saying for that is birds of a feather flock together. So if you have a population where you can imagine cooperator strategies and defector strategies, so like nice cooperators and exploitative defectors, if they're able to choose who they interact with, that really changes the modeling, right? Because so far we've looked at game theory models where we assume that who you interact with is purely a function of the proportions in the population. But here we're saying, well, actually, a lot of times animals can choose who they interact with, and that can affect the evolution of these behaviors. So if cooperators are able to choose their partners and stick together and limit or cut their ties to these exploitative defectors, well, that makes cooperation more evolutionarily stable. And so another way to summarize that is that in the little network diagram on the lower right of the slide, it's positively assorted. We see that the blue cooperators are grouping together. They're partnering with each other more often than they're partnering with the red defectors. And this positive assortment makes it easier for cooperation to evolve or be maintained over evolutionary time. Okay, so the theorists, the kind of social evolutionary theorists have shown that, again, a simple modification of Hamilton's rule can represent this idea. And the modification here is that the benefit minus k times the cost must be greater than 0. And k in this case is the average number of social partners that an individual has in the social network. So in other words, the bigger k is, the more connected, the more densely connected the network is, the harder it gets for cooperation to evolve. Okay, and so an assumption of this theoretical model, an assumption of this mathematical model, is that an individual who is playing the cooperation strategy has to help anyone that it's connected to. So that's one of the assumptions of the model here. And just to again summarize the conclusion, it's that cooperation is easier to evolve if the average number of social partners is smaller and more limited. Okay, on to our third of 4 pathways to the evolution of helping. So we've completed reciprocity now. The third pathway is called byproduct mutualism. And byproduct mutualism is when an individual would pay a cost right away if it did not help. And so another way to look at this is that it's like, well, it looks like cooperation, but actually it's not, because it's cooperation being favored as a byproduct of the cost of not helping. So in other words, there's no temptation to cheat or to defect. Okay, so here are a couple of kind of examples to make this concrete. So imagine 2 people trapped in a cave by a boulder, and neither of these people on their own can move the boulder. The boulder's too heavy for person number 1 or person number 2 to move on their own. Well, they cooperate and work together and move the boulder, but the cost of not cooperating in that case would be their own demise, right? So clearly the cost of not helping there is so great that it outweighs the small cost of providing the help. Another example would be, suppose we were thinking about kind of cooperative hunters. Well, maybe if a lion doesn't help in the hunt, it doesn't get to eat at all, right? So there's no temptation to cheat. There's no temptation to not participate in the hunt if not participating means you starve. So some people say, well, byproduct mutualism is not really cooperation. And so, the question is this still interesting to evolutionary biologists if there's no temptation to cheat? Well, I'm interested to know what you think. I think it is still interesting. And in fact, researchers have surmised that probably most of the examples of cooperation in the animal kingdom are really examples of byproduct mutualism. For one thing, I would point out that all of these pathways are not mutually exclusive. Just because a system has features of byproduct mutualism, it doesn't mean that the other mechanisms aren't contributing to the benefits of helping as well. And as I mentioned before, it's thought that byproduct mutualism might actually be the most common form of helping in nature. And so if we want to understand pro-social behavior, I mean, this is like a common kind. And the third point is that even if there's no temptation to cheat, we often see that species that are helping in these ways, they're doing these complex coordinated actions on the part of the players. And so actually helping that's favored through byproduct mutualism could be a precursor to the evolution of other mechanisms of helping as well. Okay, and so here's a short video that shows an example of the kinds of coordination involved. And this is a video of helping behavior shown by elephants. And again, I'll encourage you to click the link and go watch it on your own if it doesn't play within the lecture here. Now, I don't know if elephant helping behavior evolved through byproduct mutualism or if it evolved through some other pathway. I don't know, but I'm just using this as an example of the remarkable coordination that these animals exhibit. Okay. All right, so on to the fourth pathway to the evolution of helping. And actually, this pathway, enforcement, is a kind of byproduct mutualism. It's really the same. The only difference is enforcement is when byproduct mutualism is driven by punishment. So it's when the cost of not providing help is punished with the action of other individuals. Okay, so here's a couple of examples to help you understand what I mean. In meerkats, the dominant females sometimes evict the subordinate females from the group, and the evicted females are only allowed to return after the dominant has given birth. So that's an example of this kind of conflict behavior. Enforcement is like when cooperation only happens because there would be aggression or direct violence otherwise. Another example, in cooperatively breeding cichlids, these are fish that have helping behaviors during breeding, the helper individuals who happen to leave the nest for a few hours, and this was done experimentally where the researchers removed the helper from the nest for a few hours and then returned it. Well, when the helper was returned, they were aggressively, violently attacked and evicted from the nest, whereas those those who were permitted to stay, so if the breeders did not completely evict the helper after it returned, the ones who were allowed to stay worked even harder than they were before to help rear the young. So it's examples that these kind of complicated punishment behaviors can exist in animals outside of our own humankind. Okay, so coming back to our outline, I just want to take this opportunity to remind you that these evolutionary pathways that we've covered now to helping behavior, they're not mutually exclusive. Any one species can have more than one of these mechanisms occurring. All right, so I want to turn now to some applications of these ideas about cooperation. And the first one I want to mention is about caring for the environment. And this is the concept of the tragedy of the commons. And it's nicely illustrated by the kind of textbook diagram on this slide. And the commons is kind of an old-timey word for like a central park in a community that can be used, everybody can use it to graze their farm animals, right? So it's a shared resource. It's also called a public good. But if one or more of the users increases their use of the commons beyond the carrying capacity, so if I really want my sheep to be doing well and I graze them a lot more than the kind of the grass in the community can withstand, and I use that resource up, there's a cost that gets incurred by everybody, because that means now that everybody else in my community can't graze their sheep sufficiently. Now, this is a problem, right? And this is like the problem of our time with things like climate change and loss of biodiversity. Unless these environmental costs are accounted for and kind of addressed by the community as a whole, eventually the common resource is going to be depleted and lost. It's also a problem with things like fishing and our ocean fish stocks in oceans and lakes around the world is another example. And our pollution of the atmosphere, right? The atmosphere is this public good that we all rely on to survive. Okay, so there's a game theory model at play here. The two-player tragedy of the commons is an example of something called a prisoner's dilemma game. And we've seen examples of prisoner's dilemma games before when we first learned game theory and when we covered hawk-dove games. These prisoner dilemma games are games where the best outcome for the individual is the exploitative strategy. It's where there's an ESS for exploitation. But if everyone in the population plays exploitation, it leads to a suboptimal outcome for the group or the collective. And on the slide, I've made up like a payoff matrix that is a prisoner's dilemma, but it's not the only one, right? This is just one particular instantiation of a prisoner's dilemma. A prisoner's dilemma game is just any game where the ESS is the antisocial, aggressive, exploitative strategy, and yet when everybody does that, everybody is worse off overall. Okay, so in this game, what we can see is that if player 2 is playing the nice strategy, well, it's better for player 1 to pollute, to exploit, to take more of the resource. And if player 2 is playing the antisocial strategy, the exploitative strategy, it's still better for player 1 to pollute and take more of the resource. And so we've got this ESS here of the exploitative strategy, and yet that's going to put our population as a whole into a worse scenario than if everybody was being nice, right? Because if everybody was being nice, we'd all benefit, and yet what ends up evolving is everybody being exploitative. So this is a symmetrical game, and the same thing applies if we consider what player 2 should be doing. And so if we compare, like, the top left cell is a scenario where everybody's being nice, and the bottom right cell is the scenario where everybody's being not nice. Again, the top left cell is the best overall out of those two, and yet it's the whole system is going to evolve to this scenario on the bottom right where everybody's exploiting. So again, even though everyone would be better off in the long run if we all restrained ourselves and took good care of the environment, exploitation is an ESS. It's the strategy with the greatest relative payoff to the individual. And so that's the tragedy. That's the central problem that we face. Okay, so what I want to do this week is play a public goods game as a class. And we're going to play it for real bonus points on the final exam. So if you participate, you have a chance to get some real bonus points. All right, so here's how it's going to work. Anybody who participates, I am giving you a credit worth 1 bonus mark on the final exam, and you can choose to donate a % of your 1 point back to the public good of the class. And when you do this activity, you'll do a survey online, and you'll get to choose the amount you want to donate back to the public pool in increments of 10% between 0 and 100%. And whatever you don't donate, you keep for yourself. So let's say you've got your 1 point, let's say you donate half of it, well, you're going to keep the other half point as a bonus for yourself on the final exam. And the survey will be open until midnight on Sunday, March 20. And after the survey is done next week, I'm going to count up whatever's in the public good, whatever the players donated back, and I'm going to double it. And then I'm going to redistribute it equally among all of the players who participated, regardless of your initial donation. And you also get to keep, again, whatever you withheld. So if you withhold your entire point, then you get to keep that entire point, plus you get whatever I redistribute equally amongst yourselves. So think carefully about what you should do here, right? What do you think is the best move for yourself in this game? What do you think is the best move for the class in this game? And what are you going to do? Because this is real. This is like for a real bonus opportunity. What % of your credit, your bonus credit, will you donate? So here's the link in the slides to do this activity. And again, it's going to end midnight on Sunday, March 20. So there's a timeline to participate. If you don't participate, you won't be, you don't get any bonus on the final exam. And also on the survey, in addition to reporting your name and what your donation is going to be, I want you to think about a couple of hypothetical scenarios. Would it change your behavior if I revealed the names of the biggest donors in the class? And would it change your behavior if I revealed the names of the free riders, the people who chose to keep their entire point to themselves? I'm not going to do either of those things, but I just want you to think about and answer honestly, what would you do if I said I was going to do one of those two things? Okay, so we'll look at the results and we'll talk more about this in an upcoming lecture. All right, so I want to talk about a couple of other applications in medicine. So these are kind of loosely related to social evolution, of course, but they're very related to our everyday lives. And one is organ donation. So this is an example of helping behavior where the donor often receives no benefit. And it's something that's very much needed. So in the United States, it's been estimated that 12 people die each day while waiting for an organ transplant. So there's a much greater need for transplant organs than the current supply allows. In the United Kingdom, more than 90% of people say they support organ donation in opinion polls, but fewer than a third are actually registered as organ donors. And some people have created organ sharing networks in the past that propose to create a system for organ donation based on reciprocity. Members would promise to donate their organs upon their death, and if you joined, you would have priority as a recipient if you needed an organ. Interestingly, reciprocity is enacted into law in Singapore. And in Singapore, if you choose not to be a donor, it means that you have low priority yourself as a recipient. However, it doesn't seem to help. In Singapore, they still have very low transplant donation rates, for example, due to delays caused by family members who ask for a second opinion and things like that. So it's an interesting example where many of the concepts that we've covered in this lecture become important in like human societies. And the article that's linked at the bottom there is an interesting one if you have a chance to read it. Okay, and then another kind of related topic is empathy and kind of caringness on the part of doctors. In a study of doctor-patient communications, a large proportion of doctors did not specify how much medicine the patient needed to take or how long. And none of the doctors in this particular study checked to see whether the patient actually understood their instructions. Other research has shown that a simple 8-hour course can be an effective way to increase empathy on the part of doctors. And doctors who took this course were more likely to ask patients about their understanding, and they were also more likely to make more accurate diagnoses and more likely to recognize patients' mental health problems. So this may be important to some of you. You may go on to work in healthcare after your degree. Okay, so that's it for the applications. I want to spend the last few slides here telling you about these amazing birds in this group of bird species called manakins, including some of my own research on their cooperative behavior. And so the topic here is the coalitions or the social partnerships, social friendships that occur between males in these manakin species. And the species you're seeing here is called the long-tailed manakin. They're incredible birds. They're only about 13 grams, so it's about the size of a chickadee. Okay, and so you're going to see a video clip here. This is taken from YouTube, and you can look up others on YouTube yourself, of another manakin species called the lance-tailed manakin. So let's watch and see their courtship display. Okay, so the kind of olive-colored individual that you see in the middle of the perch right now at the end of the video, that's the female. And the two colorful individuals were a pair of male coalitionary partners. So many of the species in this clade of birds, this family of birds, cooperate for sex. So this is a group of about 50 species that live in Central and South America. And the males in these manakin species have extremely colorful plumage, long tails sometimes, and they do elaborate mating displays with leaps, cartwheels, and flips. And it's remarkable how diverse these displays are. The different manakin species all have their own weird behaviors. So each one is weirder than the next. Several manakin species have evolved these kind of social displays like the one you just saw, wherein more than one male displays together. And oftentimes in these multi-male displays, there's only one individual who owns the territory. This is the older, more dominant male typically, and he maintains the territory where that display is taking place. The other male, or sometimes more than one, is a floater. These are younger individuals. They're subordinate. They do not own their own territory yet. And what happens is, if the female likes what she sees, the male of that multi-male display who gets a chance to mate, it's only the territory holder. It's the dominant male who gets an opportunity to mate. And so this raises the question, a fascinating question, how does this helping behavior evolve? There appears to be, like at the surface, like what's in it for the floater? Why is he displaying with the territory holder if he doesn't get a chance to mate himself? Okay, and this is my favorite species of manakin, the blue manakin. They take coordination to the extreme. So this video is about a minute or so long.
Male happy? They're ready to present their dance to a female. In a carousel of movements, each male takes his turn at the front. comes the final move. Have they done enough? What's her decision? It's a yes. A great team effort.
All right. So this is a long-tailed mannequin again on this slide. So again, the males are cooperating to court the females, but only the territory owner has a chance to mate. So what do the floaters get out of it? Well, researchers have wondered about this for decades now. And in some early studies in the long-tailed mannequin, we could think of 3 hypotheses that were initially considered. The first one on this slide is immediate reciprocity. Maybe the role of territory owner and floater switches up day to day. Maybe if you go to a territory one day, it's one male who's in charge, but if you go back on another occasion, somebody else is. And that could be a case of reciprocity if that was going on. So that's our first hypothesis. Our second hypothesis on this slide is inclusive fitness. Maybe the males that are partnering up together are kin, right? Just like we saw in wild turkeys. Maybe there's an inclusive fitness benefit to helping your brother. The third possibility, the third hypothesis on this slide, is that perhaps there are benefits to being the helper individual that are delayed, and perhaps there's a benefit to eventually inheriting that territory when the current territory holder eventually dies. And these are remarkably long-lived birds. They often live from 10 to 15 years. Okay, so Dave McDonald and his colleagues from the University of Wyoming looked at these hypotheses, studying long-tailed mannequins in Costa Rica, and tracked who was who for many years. And they knocked off some of these possibilities. So they determined that there wasn't reciprocity going on. The territory holder, the guy who held that territory, was the same one, sometimes for 10 years in a row. So they weren't trading off these roles. And in fact, that territory would remain his until he died. They also determined that these partners were no more related to each other than you'd expect by choosing any 2 random males from the population. So inclusive fitness benefits do not appear to explain cooperation in this system. And then they were left with a third possibility here, which is that there's a delayed benefit of inheriting the territory. And they found that indeed the subordinate male eventually inherited the territory of the dominant, but it sometimes took years and years. In another study that Dave McDonald did on these long-tailed mannequins, he tracked carefully the social network position of the young floater males in the system. And often these males are, they don't own a territory until they're 10 years old. So they spend 9 years of their life acting as a floater until they eventually get a territory. And what they showed in this study was that the more central the young male was in the social network, the more likely he was to inherit a territory in any given year. So it's the most socially integrated floater males that are the ones that are most likely to get a territory. And so they appear to be queuing for social status. So a young male's position in the social network can predict his later success in obtaining a territory. And so this is remarkable because it highlights the kind of complexity and social skills that are happening in this bird with like the tiniest little brain. And also how the benefits of cooperation might follow surprisingly long delays, sometimes years delayed. Okay, so just to wrap up in the last few slides here, I wanted to tell you about some of my own research on a different species of mannequin, the wire-tailed mannequin. And I participated in a study where we've been tracking the social networks of these wire-tailed mannequins over many years. And in this social system, a given territory holding mannequin will have like multiple floater partners, and each floater partner will have multiple territory holding males. So it's quite a complex social system. And the graphs that you see here are representing the lek social networks in the wire-tailed mannequin, 2 of them of the 11 leks we studied over time. So you've got time 1 and time 2, and the little nodes on this diagram are individual mannequins on these leks. The first lek is a smaller one, the second lek is a bigger one. And the web of lines here is representing the social partnerships between these males. And what we did was we measured how stable these social networks were over time. So how many of the relationships at time 1 were still present at time 2. And that was our measurement of social stability. And what we wanted to understand was what explained why some groups were more socially stable than others. And so the examples here, the first one has a social stability of 0.88 out of a highest possible value of 1. And so this was one of the higher, more stable networks in our study. So there's low turnover of who is partnering with whom. And then the lower one was one of the most unstable networks in our study. It had a stability of 0.3. It had a lot of turnover in who was partnering with whom. Okay, so what we found, this is quite a complicated slide, so I'll try to walk you through one graph at a time. What we found was that stability was explained by how strong the relationships were. Stronger relationships were more stable, but also how sparse they were. Groups that had fewer relationships were also more stable. So on the top part of this graph, you see, or top part of the slide, you see two graphs that are looking at the network level. So each of the data points on these first two graphs represents a lek, a group of mannequins. And so the most stable leks are the ones that had the greater weight, the greater average weight of relationships, so kind of stronger connections between the individuals. So that's not very surprising. But also, the denser the network, the more densely connected it was, the less stable it was. And on the lower part of the slide, what we're looking at is a graph where each data point represents a partnership. And we're just looking at the probability that a partnership would be retained through time. And the partnerships that were more likely to be retained were the ones that were stronger. That's the graph on the lower left, but also the partnerships that were situated in a sparser part of the network were more stable, more likely to be maintained through time. Whereas the partnerships that were situated in kind of a densely clustered, socially really high activity part of the network, those were less likely to be maintained over time. Okay, so just to wrap up the conclusions there, we found that these social networks became destabilized when the partners interacted less often and when they had a lot of partners. Too many partners seem to destabilize the system. And so we think this occurs because these mannequins face a trade-off between having lots of weak social partnerships versus maintaining fewer strong and stable partnerships. And I think this is remarkable because it really reminds me of human friendships. Okay, so that's the end of our cooperation lecture. Just some reminders here as we wrap up. Remember, for Friday, March 18, we're going to read and discuss and have a group assignment on this wallet experiment. And when you have a few minutes, go ahead and play the public goods game. Remember, to be counted, to be included in the bonus opportunity, you have to do this survey by midnight on Sunday, March 20. All right, I'll see you soon.